Hello and welcome to the ANRCB project's module on introductory concepts in nutrition. In this video, we'll be talking about communicable or infectious diseases and how they relate to nutrition. By the end of this topic, we hope that you'll be able to recognize the importance of nutrition for preventing and managing communicable diseases. We would like you to be able to describe the cycle of malnutrition and infection and to explain the importance of proper nutrition to maximize health outcomes and quality of life for people with infectious diseases such as malaria, HIV, tuberculosis, and others. As you can see from this graph, infectious disease remains a significant portion of the global burden of disease. So key diseases such as tuberculosis, malaria, and HIV/AIDS, along with others, contribute to both morbidity and, in this graph, mortality. Now, we've discussed some of the relationships between nutrition and infection in previous topics, but to remind you, there's a strong bidirectional link between nutrition and infection. Healthy people, including children, have better nutritional status, and infection can have multiple effects. For example, it can reduce appetite, which will then reduce the amount of food and nutrients that a person will eat. It can also increase the body's requirement for nutrients. And infections of the gastrointestinal tract in particular can reduce absorption in the intestines of the nutrients that a person eats. People who are undernourished are at greater risk of infection. They may have infections of longer duration or greater severity, and this could result even in mortality. Undernourishment is also associated with changes in the gut microbiome, which has consequences that are still being investigated. So some of these relationships, here's a simple diagram to kind of show what those relationships are. Let's consider particularly the impact on children. So for all ages, malnutrition is a primary cause of immunodeficiency. There are effects on the immune system, and the effects are greatest in children of varying age and in the elderly. So we know that there's this relationship between malnutrition and infection, and these two also relate significantly with infant mortality. Poor nutrition leaves children underweight, weakened, compromised in their immune function, and vulnerable to more infections. So you can think of this as a sort of negative cycle. Undernutrition can lead to infection, and infection can lead to undernutrition. And the effects involve a reduction in immunity, an increased risk of disease, increased needs for energy and other nutrients to help fight disease, a reduction in appetite, and a reduction in gut function that reduces the absorption of nutrients. So if we look at this from the perspective of undernutrition, if we have poor diets, this can lead to weight loss, it can reduce immunity, there could be damage to the mucosa that leaves people vulnerable to pathogens, and it can, for children, impair growth and development. From the other direction, if we look at it in terms of infectious disease, malnutrition is going to be worsened by diarrhea and other kinds of illnesses and symptoms. There can be nutrient malabsorption, a loss of appetite, a loss of nitrogen in urine. All of these things lead to overall nutrient losses and further damage of defense mechanisms. We also discussed this earlier when we were talking about children and nutrition, this relationship and contribution of water, sanitation, and hygiene. So you've seen this figure before. And what I'd like to explore in a little more detail is this part here, in which fecal contamination around the home can lead to diarrhea and other symptoms, infection in general, and environmental enteropathy, which is an inflammatory condition of the gut. that results from poor water sanitation and hygiene. All of these together then can result in poor nutritional status. So here's a diagram that kind of looks at the linkages, as you can see here, basically from feces and fecal contamination through the oral route. So this fecal oral route has several different mechanisms, and measures of water sanitation and hygiene can block these mechanisms. So from feces, fecal contamination can reach a person through bodily fluids, through soil, and other aspects of the environment, through dirty floors. Flies can transmit pathogens. There can be direct contact through hands. And other objects within the household, like utensils, like spoons, clothing, toys, other objects within the normal home environment. So good sanitation can block contamination of other aspects within the home environment. You can have also good handling of water and management of water, good food hygiene and good hygienic practices such as hand washing with soap. All of these create these barriers that interrupt this fecal to oral route of contamination. Certainly with diarrhea, this is a major cause of undernutrition. And similarly, undernutrition can lead to diarrhea. That is that two-way relationship that we've been talking about. In children, diarrhea is quite common, and it can be quite dangerous if not well managed. And diarrhea is often due to poor infant and young child feeding practices and poor water sanitation and hygiene practices. Malnutrition can affect the duration of diarrhea. You can have prolonged and chronic bouts of diarrhea, and this can result in growth faltering, can even pose a risk of mortality in children especially. Diarrhea can impact nutrition in, as we were talking about, in many different ways: appetite, causing vomiting and other symptoms, poor food and nutrient intake, poor absorption of both macro and micronutrients, a quick, rapid transit through the intestines. There can be various disturbances of metabolic and endocrine functions. There can be direct loss of nutrients in the gastrointestinal tract. So all of these will ultimately reduce the nutritional status of an individual. To prevent diarrhea, the action is to improve IYCF and to improve wash practices, among others. So if we think of risk factors, IYCF is certainly a risk factor. There are also specific micronutrients that are implicated when we're talking about diarrhea. These include zinc and vitamin A. There can be also anthropometric risk factors. So if you have poor nutritional status, in particular, if a person, especially a child, has wasting, that certainly increases the risk of an adverse outcome. So in terms of management, there are other forms of management, certainly for diarrhea. The notable one is adequate hydration, sometimes using oral rehydration fluids. But in terms of diet, continued feeding, including breastfeeding, is quite important, as is correcting micronutrient deficiencies. So in many places, you will see zinc provided as a supplement to treat cases of diarrhea in young children. This seems simple and straightforward, but this is actually can be quite a challenge. Many parents confronted with a sick child with diarrhea will often change the diet of the child, maybe moving to simpler foods in the hopes of helping the young child. But actually, it's quite critical to communicate to parents that continued feeding, even increased feeding, can be beneficial for a child who suffers from diarrhea to maintain all those nutritional needs. There has been very good progress globally in addressing diarrheal disease in under 5 children in particular. This has always been a major cause of mortality but you can see here from this graph the rapid progress that has happened in all regions of the world, including in South and Southeast Asia. There is still, of course, work that remains to be done. Other kinds of infectious diseases, let me move on now to parasitic infections, starting with intestinal parasites. So these contribute to malnutrition and micronutrient deficiencies through effects on digestion and absorption of nutrients, especially in the intestines. Intestinal parasites such as helminths can be transmitted through food and through soil. And these are one of the key causes of under 5 child morbidity and mortality. Intestinal parasitic infections can cause malnutrition, including protein energy malnutrition, can lead to anemia and growth faltering in children. These kinds of infections have been associated with stunting, physical weakness, and in school children, low academic performance. Another critical parasite globally is malaria. Malaria can lead to anemia and a number of other morbidities and mortality worldwide. There are certain ages and life stages that are particularly vulnerable to malarial infection. One of these vulnerable groups is pregnant women. Pregnant women can become anemic. There are various kinds of consequences during pregnancy from malaria. The malaria parasite can even enter into the placenta, so it can affect both mother and child. Interestingly, women who are in their first or second pregnancy are particularly at risk and vulnerable to malarial parasites. There are some interesting relationships between malaria and nutrition, and I'll share some data in the coming slides. But one interesting relationship is iron. Iron is important naturally for human nutrition, but it's also important for the parasite's life cycle. And therefore, there can be these relationships between iron deficiency and iron deficiency anemia and malaria in ways that are under continuing investigation. Certainly, malaria can worsen nutritional status and result in malnutrition, especially for young children. It can lead to mortality as well. So malaria has been associated with lower weight gain and even growth faltering, especially in the under 5 age range. Here are some studies that have been done over decades, looking at the relationship between the Plasmodium, the malaria parasite, and malnutrition. This is research over a wide range of time in multiple countries, looking at different forms of malnutrition and various forms of malaria-related outcomes. And interestingly, the results are mixed. There are cases, some of these lower examples down here, where there is a synergistic relationship between malaria and poor nutrition. By this, I mean that you would find more malnourished people with worse outcomes when they have malaria. But there are some cases that have been observed where the relationship is exactly the opposite, where more nourished people will have heavier infections, and people who have greater malnutrition might have lower parasite load. So these are the studies that you see here that are labeled as antagonistic. So certainly this is an area of interest and investigation still. As far as the distribution of malaria is concerned, again, over time, there has been great progress in prevention and in treatment of malaria, but it remains a challenge throughout the tropics across the world. In Laos, recent data shows that the majority of malaria cases are from the southern provinces, where you have people who engage in more forest-related occupations, and certainly they have more exposure and more cases in those areas. Another key communicable disease that I'd like to discuss is tuberculosis, or TB. Certainly, the risk of developing TB is higher in those people who have malnutrition, in particular who have low body mass index. Poor nutrition can lead to this immune deficiency, which increases the risk of contracting and developing tuberculosis. There are certainly vulnerable groups: children of varying ages, pregnant women, the elderly, people who are economically disadvantaged, they live in poverty, who experience food insecurity, they are vulnerable. And also notably are people who live with HIV. They are more likely to develop cases of active tuberculosis. And tuberculosis can lead to the same negative effects on appetite, on absorption of nutrients, affecting metabolism in ways that lead to wasting and poor nutritional status. There have been some positive results with supplementation of both macro and micronutrients, for example, with vitamins A and D, in cases where people have tuberculosis, that can help in increasing weight gain, grip strength, and other kinds of functional indicators. Here is the incidence. So this is the new cases of tuberculosis throughout the world. And again, in many low and middle income countries, especially in the tropics, we see still large numbers of tuberculosis. And as I just mentioned, there is this relationship with HIV. So let me talk a little bit about HIV as well. HIV has been around now for decades, and it continues to be a major global health issue. There remains no cure for HIV. However, we have made enormous progress in the last few decades on preventing HIV, on having good diagnosis, treatment, and care. And that has led to this transition of HIV becoming a chronic health condition, which allows people to live a longer, healthier life if it remains well managed, if there is good access to care and treatment. This presents new challenges. So as we age, and as we'll discuss in the next topic, we have increasing incidence of non-communicable diseases. And so that raises questions on how diets, non-communicable diseases, and HIV all interact, and how to manage comorbidities when a person has not just HIV and TB, but maybe HIV and also some of these non-communicable conditions like cardiovascular disease or diabetes. So there is a fairly well-recognized linkage between HIV and nutrition. Having good nutrition allows a strengthening of the immune system, providing resistance to infection, preventing opportunistic illnesses, and helping to manage HIV-related complications, which help maintain good nutrition and keep that positive cycle going. Nutrition is also key for people who are taking antiretrovirals, that those will increase the efficacy of those drugs. And so certainly this is all very important. When this breaks down, when the immune system weakens due to HIV, then there can be the same cyclical relationship where malnutrition and susceptibility to other infections becomes a challenge for people who live with HIV. This can lead to diarrhea, to nutrient malabsorption, poor appetite, weight loss, wasting even. And so malnutrition, again, a bidirectional link that can contribute to, but also be the result of HIV disease progression. Now, when you bring HIV and TB together, their relationships with nutrition, there's a lot of synergistic interactions affecting immune function. Again, the same issues of affecting immune functions, which can lead to other opportunistic comorbidities. There's greater metabolic demands, but there are challenges to maintaining food intake in terms of appetite and so on, that can lead to nutrient deficiencies, that can lead to wasting, that increase the risk of poor outcomes with HIV and TB. So TB is a leading cause of death for people living with HIV. They need more calories, more nutrients to keep their immune system strong, but they struggle or may struggle with poor appetites and nutrient malabsorption. So the world is, as I said, making progress in terms of HIV. The numbers of new infections have decreased since the height of this epidemic. Deaths have decreased as well as care and treatment becomes available and accessible throughout the world. However, because people are not able to cure themselves of HIV and they're surviving, what we have as a consequence is an increasing number of people who live with HIV. That number will always continue as long as we have good survival and infections continue. This number will keep growing, and that will add to our disease burden and the need for our health systems to respond to the challenge. Laos has relatively low infection rates. Thankfully, there are other parts of the world that have higher rates, and good progress is here. So to summarize this brief section, we see that communicable diseases are transmitted in all sorts of ways that we've given some examples of in this topic, whether that's direct contact, the oral fecal route, water, air, soil, food, insects, or other disease vectors. Most of these diseases have a strong, clear, two-way relationship with malnutrition. Healthy diets and good nutrition are critical to maintain and to prevent infection. And healthy diets are a way that people who have chronic communicable diseases, how to allow them to manage symptoms, to maximize the benefits of their medications, and to enhance their quality of life overall. All right, so this will conclude topic 7 of module 1. Thank you very much for your attention.